this history of how, what I'm calling the economic style of reasoning sort of moved into Washington and spread around and took over. But a big part of what I'm also trying to do is show how that had long-term consequences. And it had those effects, particularly for Democrats. And I think, some of my original motivation in writing this book was sort of, being a product of, coming of age in the 1990s and sort of seeing the constraints on democratic politics. And so I really wanted a way to tie very clearly this historical story to constraints on what politics on the left look like that I think are still, were certainly in place in the Obama administration, and I think are still there today.
Absolutely. I mean, you combine despite the changes aesthetics, right? Of course, and I was young when Obama was first getting elected. It was my first formative political experience. The hope and change thing really got to me. But you look at the actual accomplishments, ACA, Dodd-Frank, et cetera. They really do not come close to the ambitions of the policy sets, the policy goals of liberals, Democrats in the 30s and the 70s.
Yeah. And part of what I'm trying to argue here is that what we really had happen was that a particular set of tools for thinking about policy first introduced into Washington and then really spread around, became sort of taken for granted, and really shaped the kinds of policy options that we considered in the future. And so, so when I talk about an economic style of reasoning here, I'm talking about sort of a basic Econ 101 kind of microeconomic reasoning. So thinking about incentives, choice, efficiency, trying to promote choice and competition, these sort of very basic ideas. But as they became more prominent in policymaking, what ends up happening is that in some ways they also become sort of a limiting factor on what kinds of policies can be considered. And so policies that were some of the major accomplishments of Democrats in the 1960s, for example, something like Medicare, if it had to try to be passed a couple of decades later, when you have institutions like the Congressional Budget Office offering scores on policy that predict their costs, it simply wouldn't have been possible to introduce them in the same way.
Yeah, I think I said 70s, but I meant 60s in terms of the ambitions. The parliamentarian basically being the president seems like the culmination of a lot of those things. But I guess let's start when that economic style of reasoning began to replace the equality rhetoric. Where do you begin to draw that starting to happen historically?
Yeah, so I really see this as starting to be introduced in Washington in the 1960s. And so it is, of course, emerging before that, but it comes from a couple of different places. And one prominent place that it's coming from is, maybe unexpectedly, from the Rand Corporation. And so you've got a bunch of economists from the Rand Corporation who come to Washington. They are interested, they're coming to the Defense Department, first of all, and they're interested in trying to make defense budgeting, make defense spending more cost effective. And so they're perceived as being very successful at what they're doing in the Defense Department. And as President Johnson is trying to ramp up the Great Society, he decides to include some measure of requiring these same kinds of methods to be used in all sorts of different public agencies. And so because the Great Society is resulting in this big rapid expansion of government at the time, what that means is that this economic style of thinking is really carried into all sorts of places within Washington. And so in a way, it's really sort of an unintentional outgrowth of the expansion of government, sort of also creates these tools for trying to rein it back in as well.
It's incredibly ironic that defense spending was the origin of that kind of thought, given the fact that that's probably the one thing left in Washington that has zero thresholds for efficiency, as neoliberal economics and conservatives like to talk about.
Yeah, no, it is ironic. And, it is also ironic that the budgeting system that was put in place at the time, it was something called the planning, programming, budgeting system, and the Defense Department still uses it, but it's the only place really that uses it. Everybody else kind of quit using it after 1970.
That's nuts.
Yeah.
So how do you you talk about the microeconomic concepts of incentives, efficiency, et cetera. Yeah, more broadly, how do you define that style of thinking, I guess, as being applied to policy sets like social spending or healthcare within that, environmental policy, antitrust, et cetera?
Yeah, so I think if you had to boil this way of thinking down to a single word, it would probably be efficiency, and different ways of thinking about the question of efficiency. And then what that looks like as it applies to different kinds of policy domains, looks somewhat different. And so in healthcare policy, for example, one way you see this play out is that there's a move away from arguing for universal healthcare as sort of a political ideal. And instead you get more of a focus of thinking about, well, how do we try to make healthcare as cost effective as possible? How can we make sure that the people who can afford to pay for it are paying for it on their own? Are there ways to try to ensure that people don't use more healthcare than they actually need? And this is often coming from people who desire the expansion of healthcare to more people and who are not anti-government, who are not trying to shrink government, but who really see this as a central value. But it comes into conflict with these more fundamental values and more fundamental language around things like rights to healthcare.
Right. And so that's like one of the things that not shocked me, but I really appreciated your emphasis on how this was really infecting liberals to a degree. Like, you always had conservatives wanting to cut costs, I guess. But it was the most insidious part of this is that this is what took over Democrats' thinking, and it kind of defangs any talk of equality or broad social spending that would have any sort of bloat as thought of by traditional economic thinking that, in my opinion, is inapplicable to how a government should run. But you have government should run like a business. That kind of stuff comes from the right. But really, as you write, in the 70s, it's adopted by the left.
Yeah, and that was really part of the story that I wanted to tell here, because I think there's been a lot of attention to sort of free market economics and the Chicago School and economic schools of thought that are more associated with conservatives or libertarians. But this more technocratic economic style that, again, is not entirely, but mostly promoted by Democrats, has its own kind of effects on what the limits of policymaking are. And one of the things I think you see happen is that by the time that you've got, so this is taking over, it's pretty influential by the time of, say, the Carter administration. But when Reagan comes into office, he is able to use this economic style much more strategically. So when it sort of lines up with his existing policy preferences, he promotes it and encourages it. And in places where it doesn't line up so well, he sort of just sidesteps it or gets rid of it. So he's better able to use it strategically rather than sort of being constrained by it.
I want to talk about Reagan and how he was able to do that, but let's focus a bit on the 1970s, where this all really starts to ramp up. The welfare state starts to begin to be chipped away. Neoliberalism this is like when things are starting to escalate. Can you talk a little bit about how this kind of thinking responded to even Nixon's environmental reforms, and how then that's how this started to get adopted a bit more?
Yeah, environmental policy is sort of an interesting sub-story within this, because environmental policy was actually an area in which economics came fairly late to the game. And so, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, 1970, 1972, these were not yet strongly influenced by economic reasoning. And so these bills were written into law, they're kind of coming out of social movements. They are grounded in these ideas about ecology. They are framed around these absolute rights to a clean environment. And they don't take costs into account for explicit political reasons, because there's concern that if you introduce too much focus on costs, it's going to lead to regulatory capture. And what ends up happening is that almost as soon as these laws pass, there is unsurprisingly a backlash against them from companies who don't want to be regulated in this way. And those companies start advocating for more use of cost-benefit analysis of regulations. And what kind of ends up happening here is that you've got economists within, particularly within the Carter administration, who are advancing the idea of more cost-benefit analysis because they're true believers in efficiency, right? They're not trying to reduce environmental regulation on its own sake, but they sort of end up becoming allies with industry because who's trying to pursue the same goal, but for very different reasons.
Right. So is it fair or too cynical to talk about the deployment of that term as a way to put brakes on larger reforms to benefit any interests that would be regulated as more regulations come into play at the latter half of the 20th century?
Yeah, and that language has absolutely been used to rein in the possibilities of what kinds of regulation can be put into place. Now, there have been instances where it's backfired. So, for example, Reagan thought that he was going to be able to use this sort of cost-benefit approach to promote, to limit the backlash against leaded gasoline. And so we thought, we don't want to have to get rid of leaded gasoline. Let's do a cost-benefit analysis, and that will help. Well, it turned out in that case, the costs were just so high that no matter what, it just turned out to be overwhelmingly cost-effective to get rid of unleaded gasoline. And so in that case, it backfired. But for the most part, that wasn't the case.
And we've seen this recently in terms of like these technocratic studies within the government about the costs of what climate change will eventually bring. There are cost benefit analyses done, and then they're just ignored when they don't meet, the political moment for the particular politicians in power.
Yeah, and I do think this is part of what actually ends up happening is that, like you said, often cost-benefit analyses are sort of window dressing on the real power politics that's going on behind the scenes. But at the same time, they can be sort of an effective tool for disciplining people who are arguing for something more aggressive. And so it's a way to make more progressive positions seem unreasonable or not sufficiently serious, not being willing to consider costs of policies. And it's used in this political way, even though it wouldn't necessarily have to be.
Yeah. Can you talk a bit about how this kind of thinking manifested itself in the Carter administration? Because, Carter deregulated a few things, the airlines in particular, my most hated nemesis, because they still are so underregulated. It's insane. He's presented colloquially as a idealistic lefty who couldn't get things done, but he got that part done.
Yeah, no, Carter was very much broadly aligned with this kind of way of thinking. He came from this engineering background. The idea of efficiency appealed to him. He generally was a supporter of this kind of approach to policymaking. And, and in the case of transportation deregulation, people had been trying to do this for some time. But the original reasons that regulation was put into place in the 1930s and earlier, which was really about ensuring stability in markets as much as anything, suddenly starts to seem outdated, and these questions are raised about can we make these markets more efficient by deregulating them? And so Carter's a big supporter of that. He brings in people like Alfred Kahn, who was, his deregulation czar. And Kahn says things like that, he's happy to see the Teamsters' wages cut as long as it means that, that the market's becoming more efficient.
So how much of that was, how swift was that transition within the Democratic Party from, like, say, the start of the 1970s to then you have pre-Reagan Carter just eating up that kind of, is it the chicken or the egg thing? Did that allow Carter to rise to the top? What was that? That seems like a very immediate takeover of the Democratic Party in a short period of time with that ideology.
Yeah, I think it was a little bit more gradual than that. I think the real 1965 to 1980 is probably kind of the key period. But Carter was, in some ways, I think, a lucky break as much as anything. I certainly don't think that the influence of economic reasoning was a reason that Carter got elected. And I also, don't want to underestimate the influence of everything else that was going on politically and economically at the time. But certainly by the time that Carter's administration is wrapping up and by the early years of the Reagan administration, this has become kind of the dominant approach within the Democratic Party. And it really stays that way, certainly through the Obama years.
And how did, during that period of 65 to 80, as you talk about, both interest groups in that arena begin to grow, and also how did, through their influence and politicians buying in, how did those reforms become institutionalized through law?
Yeah, the interest groups kind of played different roles in different policy domains, right? So one other area that I talk a lot about in the book is antitrust policy. And in antitrust, you had a very strong enforcement regime in the 1950s and 60s. You start to have economic arguments for relaxing it that kind of are becoming more influential in the 60s and 70s. And then at the same time, you have, Fortune 500 companies, really the very, very biggest companies, who are also strongly advocating for less antitrust enforcement and who are very explicitly supporting the people who are trying to introduce more economics into antitrust policy. And so you do often have this aligning of particular interests in specific policy domains. But then in terms of how it actually gets institutionalized in policymaking, part of the story of this book is that it's less about people with actual economics degrees coming to Washington and being in some kind of advisory position and having the ear of the president. It's really about being embedded into lots of different obscure offices within Washington, and having less direct kinds of influence, for example, through the creation of public policy schools, which didn't exist prior to the late 1960s, but kind of go on to train whole generations of people who go on to take positions in Washington in the sort of basics of this way of thinking about policy.